So, hi. We are actually here tonight to hear a presentation about the Affordable Housing Trust Action Plan. It is a presentation to both the Board of Selectmen, the community, and members of the trust who are here. But since we have a posted Selectmen's meeting, I will just briefly call the, Tuesday, June 26th, Selectmen's meeting, second Selectmen's meeting to order, the 7 p.m. Selectmen's meeting to order. And I will immediately turn the podium over to the chairman of our Affordable Housing Trust. And just so, for the camera purposes, people don't get confused, I'm going to go sit in the audience for the presentation so I can actually see it. So,
me too.
Take it away, Josh.
All right.
I'll take over up here.
Hi, my name is Josh Anderson. I'm the chair of the Affordable Housing Trust. The trust was formed in 2009 with the purpose of preserving and creating affordable housing in the town of Wenham. And we started off, I joined the trust in 2011, and we've had some successes and some doldrums. And so a couple years ago, we decided to re-evaluate our mission, and we had a housing needs study done. And the follow-up from the housing needs study was to create an action plan, which we've worked on over the last 9, 10, 11 months. And today is the big unveiling of that action plan. And to do that, we hired Jennifer Goldson as a consultant who is the premier consultant for this type of work in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And we've been very pleased to work with her. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm happy to be here. So I'm going to go through a little bit about the background of housing trusts and what affordable housing is too, in addition to going through the action plan. And the town was kind to make these copies available. So if you didn't get one, I think it's right out on the podium right outside. And then they've also copied the presentation slides. So our task was to help the Housing Trust create an action plan that lays out priorities and initiatives for the next 5 years. So this is a 5-year plan. And the question that we kept going back to, that's really at the heart of this whole process, is how should these trust funds be utilized? So we're going to talk about a lot of things, but that's really at the heart of what this is all about. We started in last summer, the end of last summer, with a community tour and kickoff meeting. Then in the fall, many of you were involved in these focus groups and interviews. I recognize some of you from that. We really tried to reach out to various stakeholders and leaders in the community and to hear a variety of perspectives about what do they think this housing trust should be doing? What do they think are the priorities around housing in Wenham? And I tried to get a good basis for going forward. And then through the course of the late fall and into the winter, we outreached and invited folks to a community workshop. And I'm curious, how many of the people in the audience were at that workshop? I think some of you were. Yeah, okay, great. Well, thank you for coming back to hear this presentation. And I'll talk a little bit about more about the workshop and what we learned from that. And then in February, we reviewed those results with the trust. In the spring, we started to prepare an action plan, and I worked very closely with the trust to look at the priorities, look at possible budgets and funding sources, and we went through a few different exercises with the trust to come up with what's in the final plan. And then we're here in June to present that to you tonight. So these are some pictures of the community workshop. We had very good attendance. It was at the church across the street. Is that called First Church? First Church in Wenham? Yeah. And we structured this workshop as a very interactive format. So I gave a presentation, but then we had folks move around to different tables and talk about different aspects of what the trust could do, where the funding could come from, and really brainstorm ideas. And so some of the main conclusions, there's a summary of this meeting that I'm sure folks can have in full, but I just pulled out some of the main conclusions. Participants were very supportive in general of meeting the 10% affordable housing requirement as a priority for use of the trust funds. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by those terms. What is 10%? Where does that come from? What do I mean by affordable housing? Many of the participants felt that increasing Wenham's diversity, particularly allowing seniors to age in place and welcoming new residents and families to the town, were important reasons to create new affordable housing. Participants at the workshop also expressed a preference for smaller, more spread out, affordable units rather than large concentrated developments, as well as the rehabilitation of existing homes to convert to affordable housing. They also talked quite a bit about funding sources. That was one of the tables that people rotated to. And so the use of Community Preservation Act funds, also negotiating more developer fees, which is a source of trust funding in the past. Perhaps getting lease payments from cell towers. That was just an idea that I actually threw out, and some people latched onto that idea as a way to make some revenue for the trust. And then seeking private donations is another way that the trust can raise revenue. The participants at the workshop also, it was very evident that they care very deeply about the community and have a really strong sense of this community, that it's a small town, it can offer a lot to residents, and they want to increase the diversity of its residents and make the town more welcoming in general, but also maintain those small town characteristics that people love about Wenham and the reason why many of you are here and stay here. So just raise your hand if that captures generally what you expected, I would say, that we learned at the community meeting. Okay, yeah. So now let me just give you some basics of what a housing trust even is, so we're all talking about the same thing. So a housing trust is a municipal entity. So it is part of the municipality. A municipality has the ability to create that under state law, and Wenham created it in 2009. And there are really two purposes. One is to collect funds for affordable housing, and two, it creates a place, a trust, to put those funds to get them out of the general municipal budget. So you could also use funds in the general municipal budget to do some of these things that the trust can do. But the idea of the trust is that you put it aside for this particular purpose. And then the trust can be used for two general things. Now, within these two things, there's lots of things you can do. But the two purposes are to create affordable housing and to preserve affordable housing. And I'll talk about those terms a little bit more. But those are the two things a trust can do: create and preserve affordable housing. So the trustees are appointed by the Board of Selectmen, and their job is to recommend the use of the trust funds back to the Board of Selectmen. And then the Board of Selectmen makes the final decision on how those funds are used. The current balance is about $870,000. And the trust has created two affordable units. One was an ownership unit and one is a rental unit, and both of them are in existing houses. So now, before I go on, I've already used this term and I haven't defined it well yet. So what I want to do is talk to you a little bit about what do I mean when I say the term affordable housing. And I'm talking about something very specific. I'm talking about housing that counts toward the state's goal of 10%. So raise your hand if you're already familiar with the fact that the state has a goal under Chapter 40B that says that every town and city in the state of Massachusetts should have its fair share of affordable housing, meaning 10% of your total year-round housing stock. Raise your hand if you feel like you already knew that. Okay. So I think pretty much everybody just raised their hand. But if you do have questions, if I'm saying something that makes no sense, just raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions as I go. So in order to track how many units a municipality has to help meet that count toward that 10%, there's something called a subsidized housing inventory. Raise your hand if you've heard of that term before. Okay, so many of you, but not all. And that's just essentially a list. It's actually one of the appendices in this plan is the list. It's a list of all the units that count in each community toward that 10%. And you may wonder, well, how does a unit get on that list? So first of all, it has to be affordable to households that make 80% of the area median income or less. And I'm going to tell you exactly what those numbers are on the next slide. Or it has to be part of a rental development where at least 20 to 25% of those units are affordable to 80% of the area median income to households that make that much or less. And the luxury units, the market rate units in a rental development also count on your subsidized housing inventory. That's different for ownership. Raise your hand if that makes sense and if you've heard that before. Kind of makes sense. Does anybody have a question about what I mean by, I know I didn't tell you the actual income yet, but knowing I'm going to tell you that on the next slide. Yes?
So you said that a rental development with 20% affordable, 100% of the units count towards affordable housing.
20 or 25% affordable. It depends on the funding mechanism. Yep.
But then, so if it's 25%, then all of them would count.
That's right. Even the 75% that are market rate.
So in the end, you'd have like 2.5% really affordable, if that's the whole 10%.
Yeah, I'm not following your math, but the point is, yeah, the point is, if you have a rental development that you approve as a 40B, then every unit in that whole development counts, even though only 25% are probably deed-restricted affordable units. Yeah, and that's different for condos or ownership units. So the state's built that in as a way to encourage communities to approve rental projects. So now you may wonder, how are the income limits actually determined? And they change every year, and I'm going to tell you they're determined by the federal government. So it's the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. People call it HUD. And it's determined not by the area, the median income of people who already live in Wenham. It's determined by the median income of the people who live in this big gray area that I'm showing. It's a very large area. There's over 100 municipalities in this area. It includes 5 counties in Massachusetts, and it also includes a little bit of New Hampshire. So it's a very big area, and the reason that the federal government looks at this big area, they do this all over the country. They break out the whole country into these big areas, and they set a median income for that area, and that's how they determine the affordable income. And that's to help fair housing so that people can really move between communities. If you set a market, an affordable price just based on what Wenham residents make, it would be much higher income, and it would be much harder for people who live in other areas of this region to afford an affordable unit in your community. Are you following the logic? Okay. And so every year they change. And so for fiscal year 2018, which is the current federal fiscal year, the HUD income limits for your area, it's called the Boston, Cambridge, Quincy metro area, that big, large area that I showed on the map before. If you have a household of 4 people and you make $81,100 or less, then you are considered low to moderate income, and you could potentially qualify for affordable housing. How many people already knew that number and are not surprised at all? A few of you. And if you're a single person living alone and you make $56,800 or less, you could qualify for affordable housing. Now, I say could and not would, very specifically on purpose, because they also look at your assets. So there are asset limits when they look at, do you actually qualify or not?
So they're not limited to just cash in your
Exactly.
bank account?
Exactly. They look at if you own any property and the value of that property. And different programs have different asset limitations, but it's often no more than $75,000 in assets to qualify, and that income. And so I only put 1, 2, 3, and 4 person households on this, but it goes up. If you have 8 people, it's a different income. And if anybody wants me to send you all the income for each household, I can do that. I just didn't want to bog up this slide. Does anybody have any questions on that aspect? Okay. Oh, and the other thing people ask is, well, if you have a 4-person household, does it matter if they're all adults, if they're some children, and if only some are working? And it doesn't matter. It's 4 people living in a household, whether or not they're related by blood or marriage or roommates. It doesn't matter if only 1 is a adult and 3 are kids. It's just if 4 people live in a household and they make up to or less than $81,100, then you could count as low or moderate income. Yes.
So if you had 4 college students living together, 4 people, and they made under that, they would qualify as a household?
Possibly, but there are different programs where students aren't
Well,
typically.
not even students.
Yeah, okay. Students typically aren't eligible for affordable housing, but if you had a household of 4,
Sisters lived together and.
yeah,
On a.
and their income was less than $81,100 combined, and they had less than $75,000 in assets, they could potentially qualify.
So there's no relation requirement.
No. So you had a needs assessment. It must have been 2017, Josh. I advised you poorly. I told him it was 2016. Yeah. And your needs assessment looked at a lot of data and information and what your current housing stock is, and it looked at your demographic trends. And one of the biggest trends in not just your town, but in the region really, is that you have an aging population. And it looked at the gap between what kind of housing stock you have, where your community demographics are changing, and what kind of housing needs there are in this community to really meet those changes. So all of the communities in this region, every community I work in really, has changing demographics, and typically it's an aging demographic. And so these are the 4 kind of highlights, but if you're really interested in all the details about how did they get to these conclusions, I would encourage you to read that plan. I'm sure it's still on the website, but I'm also sure that someone on the trust could point you to where that plan is if you can't find it. But the bottom line was that it concluded you need more rental housing, including for local workers. You need more first-time homebuyer options, more handicap accessible units, including for the aging population. And just to describe that a little bit more, units that are designed to enable independent living for persons with disabilities. For example, units that have ramps or elevators, wider doorways, grab bars. Housing with support services. So we call this in the field service-enriched housing. And that means that it's units, usually it's not just a single unit, it's a cluster of units that have services to help support people for aging in the units or for other disabilities. And so it says here, service-enriched housing provides services necessary to help disabled individuals remain independent for as long as possible. And so when you think about having an aging population, this is a very important thing to think about. Can people who have lived in this community, for example, age either in the home they're in now, or do they have the option to stay part of this community and age in a service-enriched unit, and hopefully an accessible unit as well? Any questions on these 4 highlights from the Housing Needs Assessment? This was background information that we looked at the very beginning of the project to understand housing needs.
So this is just focused on what's in Wenham itself?
Yeah.
Not surrounding areas?
No, it looks just at the town and what kind of housing stock you actually have and how you could support the demographics of your community as it's changing. Yes?
And what constitutes local workers?
Well, that was a very broad term. I don't know that they defined that. I think that, generally when people talk about local workers, they think about municipal employees, maybe firefighters, police, could be people who work in this. I know you don't have a lot of businesses in the community, but it could be people who work in businesses in the community. So typically that's what the term means in general. But I do just want to make a point that because of, remember how I showed you that regional map a few slides ago? And I said something about fair housing and the prices are set to be affordable to people in the whole region. Well, I want to just point out that you really can't just build housing that's restricted to people with a local connection because of the fair housing issues around that. You want to make sure that people from that whole region could potentially live in these affordable units so that people have mobility within the region. Happy to talk more about that. It's a very complicated subject, and I actually do trainings on fair housing, so I don't want to get too sidetracked, but you can do housing for local workers. You just can't do it only for local workers. So I'm about to launch into, well, what does this plan actually say? But before I do that, I want to make the point that as a planner, I think, and I'm not unusual as a planner, but as a planner, I think it's important that when you create local goals and strategies for a community, that it really should be customized to the community. And that's why we went through a fairly rigorous process between the focus groups and the interviews and the community engagement, and then working very closely with the trust to come up with an approach that we think could work for the revenue sources that we think you might have access to for the trust, as well as the political environment in the community and potential opportunities in the community. And I could talk a little bit more about that, but I just wanted you to know that we thought very carefully about how can we customize these strategies and goals for this community. So in the action plan, and you'll see this in the table of contents, there is a mission for the trust, goals, priority initiatives, and a 5-year budget. And I'm going to talk about each one of those in this presentation. What I'm not going to talk about, there's also a lot of background information. Some of it I just went over, like, what do I mean when I say affordable housing? What are the income limits? What is the subsidized housing inventory in Wenham? What are the powers of the trust? How will the trust operate? I'm not going to get into those details tonight, because I really wanted to focus in on the bigger things, like what are the goals, what are the initiatives, and what's the budget. But just know, and I encourage you all to read the whole plan, there's a lot more in it. So we worked very carefully on this wording. And this is just excerpted directly. I didn't change one word. I just changed the spacing to make it easier to digest in a slide. But the Trust's mission, as adopted through this plan, is to guide the allocation of trust funds to most effectively address Wenham's housing needs, including but not limited to achieving and maintaining compliance with Chapter 40B, through initiatives that foster appropriately scaled, located, and designed affordable and mixed income housing. So it's pretty straightforward, but I have to say we thought very carefully about each and every word. So I'm curious if anybody has any question about what this is trying to say. Okay. Yeah, so that's a subjective opinion. But I want you to know that the trust is very aware that that's something that's important to the community and to neighbors. And so when they're looking at what should they fund, they're not just looking at, are we going to get to that 10% with this project or these initiatives? They're also looking at, do we think this project is context sensitive? And remember, everything the trust recommends needs to go to the Board of Selectmen for final approval. So there are 4 goals. And each goal is described more in the plan, but I'm just going to give you the basic text of each goal. So goal 1 is to advance, and we did order these specifically in a way that was showing priorities. We thought about the order of these. So 1, advance public awareness of housing needs and community benefits of affordable housing, it goes on to explain. And so not all trusts take on this type of activity of looking at public awareness. Sometimes communities have other entities in town that are already looking at public awareness and enhancing public awareness. Some communities have housing committees that are really geared toward policy and community relations, but Wenham doesn't have that kind of body. So we talked about, is this something that the trust wants to do? And is this a need in the community to try to advance public awareness around these issues? And we learned at every step of the process through the focus groups and interviews, as well as in the community workshop, that this was something that is important for the community, and that affordable housing, really in any community, including in Wenham, can be and has been a divisive thing. And they want to try to help work to mend those issues going forward. Any questions on that general goal? So the second goal, they have a very specific goal. They want to try to create 26 units of affordable housing that counts on the subsidized housing inventory in the next 5 years. And so the goal reads as this: prioritize the allocation of trust funds to help Wenham achieve the Chapter 40B 10% goal for affordable housing. So that's goal 2.
So this is just a self-inflicted design.
Yeah, the trust doesn't have to only create this type of housing that would count, but everything we heard was that this is the priority in Wenham right now.
Right.
Oh, and I should also say that if you get past the 26 units, and that accounts for some change in the 2020 census as well, to be on the safe side, you'll achieve your 10% goal. Goal number 3 is to support initiatives to help address local housing needs. And we talked a lot about the aging population. This graphic is meant to think about, how do you support people in all life stages, and can people stay in this community? And so it gets back specifically to those 4 general housing needs I presented in a few slides ago from the 2017 study. And so they're going to be looking at, are the initiatives that we're doing supporting those local housing needs, in addition to helping us get to 10%. And then the last goal, number 4, is advocate for town policy and regulations to promote the creation of affordable housing. Now, this is not something that you would need to spend a lot of trust funds on, but it's really becoming an advocate for looking at the zoning bylaw, looking at other town policies perhaps, and how well and how can the town promote the creation of affordable housing that's context sensitive, that's in locations that make sense in the community, and how do your town policies and regulations either help to encourage that or help to inhibit that? And not all trusts take this role either. So this was a conscious decision, again, back, same as goal number 1 about public awareness, is how can we help promote things beyond just spending our funds and allocating our funds that can really help the town create housing that's appropriate. Any questions on that one? Okay, so I'm going to launch into the strategies now, or initiatives. And so there are 9 priority initiatives over the next 5 years, and they're in 4 categories. So we've categorized them by short-term, fiscal years 19 to 20, intermediate, fiscal years 21 to 23, things that are just ongoing as opportunities arise, and I'll describe all of these, and then long-term. So we'll start with short-term. So there are 2 in the short term. Really, in the next 2 years, they want to, 1, actively promote the construction of appropriately scaled and located subsidized housing inventory eligible affordable housing on tax title or surplus town properties. And the town maintains an inventory of town property and property that has been taken for tax foreclosure, for failure to pay taxes. And there could be some development opportunities. They're not large development opportunities. And so that's why this really focuses on smaller scale opportunities. Some things that came up when we were talking about this is, would Habitat for Humanity be interested in developing on a small tax title property, you know, a single or a duplex? And so that's something that we talked about quite a bit. And I'm not saying Habitat, you know, there are definitely 30B requirements around looking at how to dispose of town property and tax title land. But an entity like that is a possibility. And then number 2 is foster the conversion of existing houses to affordable units. We talked about this a lot. It was important to the trust to include this type of strategy because the community kept saying it over and over at every stage of our engagement. But we did talk about how expensive that can be as a way to create units. It costs more per unit, and you can build less units at a time than if you you'll see another strategy a little bit later that would be looking at a little bit larger scale development, and that often costs less money per unit. But the trust felt so strongly that the community wants us to keep looking at existing houses because they're already there, they fit into the community, and like we did with the other two properties, can we do some smaller scale things like that where we're not looking to build new, but looking to convert a few more homes? Any questions about these short-term goals? So this is what they want. I strongly advise that they don't bite off too much in the first couple years. I wanted them to find a couple things they could do with the money they have now that they could get something going. It's not going to be large, but they'll get something going. And that was the idea of these two strategies in the next 2 years. And then when we look at intermediate terms, so years 21 to 23, FY 21 to 23, this is where looking at, can we actively promote the construction of appropriately scaled and located, again, SHI, subsidized housing inventory eligible, affordable housing on privately owned property. And there are, ideas. I'm not going to get into them here, and they're not gotten into in the plan, but within the community, and I think they might be talked about a bit in the housing plan, about are there areas that are privately owned in the community that maybe they, through estate planning or through some other mechanism, the trust can help to promote the development of those sites at some point in the future, and potentially using some of their trust funds to support a development of affordable or mixed income housing on some private property. So this is a little bit of a longer term. There's more lead up time when you're looking at private properties and turning over. The trust has the ability, in theory, to buy property to create affordable housing. They just don't really have enough money to do that. So the thought is to look at, can we negotiate this to happen and perhaps offer some money to help create these affordable units. Does this make sense? I know I'm talking in very general terms about this. Okay. So then ongoing, we have a lot of ongoing ideas. And some of these really don't cost a lot. One would be to potentially, if there is a proposed development, remind me the name of the development on the golf course? Wenham Pines. So something like that, where you have a proposal that a developer has made on private property. The trust could potentially use its funds to buy 1 or 2 more affordable units, let's say, by negotiating with the developer that's already being planned. And so the town actually is very good at negotiating this through their zoning bylaw and through the special permit process that the planning board goes through. But the trust could also look at, well, can we get another affordable unit in this proposed development? So that's one idea, and that's in the ongoing category because you don't know when those opportunities will arise. It's really based on the private market, and are there any developments out there that we think would be appropriate to try to get another 1 or 2 units in using trust funds. Does that concept make sense to people? Do you have any questions about that? The next idea is to really look at, well, how can we implement goal number 1? We talked about raising local awareness around housing issues. And the idea here, and there's action steps in each of these strategies too, that I'm not getting into here, but the idea is, can the trust build a campaign around affordable housing, the needs of affordable housing in the community, and the benefits to Wenham? And we have all sorts of ideas about how to do it, but it's really an ongoing thing. It's about communications, it's about messaging, and it's about getting in front and out in front of things. Does anybody have any general questions about that? And so this is a small budget item, but it's something that the trust may use some funds to create materials, infographics, brochures, and then it's more about using their time. The sixth is to promote progressive zoning bylaws that offer attractive incentives to create affordable housing. Now, we're not listing any specific ideas in this, but one idea that came up was the trust could fund a study, a diagnostic of what your zoning bylaw allows now, what it doesn't allow, and are there ways that the zoning bylaw could allow some more housing options that are not inappropriate to the neighborhoods. And so it's a very general recommendation, but if you'll remember in I think it was goal 4, they wanted to see, can we promote more flexible regulations and zoning bylaws? The 7th is looking at all the different housing entities, really in the region, as well as in the town. For example, the Housing Authority would be a housing entity in the town. But looking more broadly too, and how can we foster strong communication about what is Wenham doing, what's happening out in the region, and are there any efforts that we can integrate? And so the trust members themselves going out to various meetings and events in the region and really being, if somebody has a question about affordable housing in Wenham, they would know to contact the trust to find out more about that. And then the 8th idea for ongoing is to inventory and maintain relevant documents on all of your existing affordable housing units. So your existing units have deed restrictions or regulatory agreements that are supposed to keep them affordable in the long term. But some of them will expire at some point in the future, not really that soon. And then others, as they're being, let's say a unit is being sold, sometimes you can't find an affordable household that qualifies in the time that you have. And some of those units can go on the open market or even be lost as affordable. It all depends on what kind of regulatory agreements, deed restrictions are in place. But the idea here is that the trust can serve as a watchdog and really keep track of what are all the units, gather all the relevant documents so they know the terms of the deed restriction, and be the local entity that's really being the watchdog over those so that you don't lose them. Does that make sense? Yes.
Does the Housing Authority maintain that inventory?
No, not for the affordable units that are not theirs. So there are affordable units in some private developments that the Housing Authority wouldn't be monitoring.
I have a question. Like you mentioned in number 7, housing entities. What are the various housing entities in Wenham?
Well, the main one I can think of in Wenham is the Housing Authority.
Right, Enon Village.
Yep. Yeah, at Enon Village.
So isn't their purview really Enon Village? Like, are they kind of really covering the whole?
They're not covering the whole town, but they do meet a need. They help to meet a need in your community for senior and disabled housing. So the trust is really seeing their role as not just about utilizing trust funds, but really being a way to enhance communication between the different entities that are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to meet your local needs, and so is the Housing Authority. And there are regional entities that are doing that for the region. And so it's really about communication and keeping the lines open. Sometimes there are also opportunities, and we talked a little bit about this. Are there opportunities to expand Housing Authority property? Some housing authorities have scattered sites in towns that they maintain, particularly around family housing, where the trust could even, if an opportunity arose, the trust could help the Housing Authority in some way expand their stock. It would probably be in a very limited way because the trust doesn't have a lot of resources. But that's a possibility. And without the strong communication and those lines open, those opportunities wouldn't be realized.
Jennifer, if I could just jump in on that. Would the town becoming more actively involved in the home consortium be another example of a way that we could connect
Yes.
with kind of those regional efforts that are ongoing that we
Absolutely.
haven't necessarily been engaged in?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
And then one other question I had on bullet point number 6 was, has the trust talked at all about the Housing Choice Initiative that the Baker administration has rolled out and kind of where that folds in?
We haven't spent time talking about that, no.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I mean, it's relatively a new
Yeah.
program, but they are, it's designed to do a lot of what you're talking about.
Exactly, yeah.
Under that rubric, okay.
Okay, and then long-term, we recognize that, if the trust, or when the trust is successful at creating the units that their goal, what did I say? Now I can't remember, 26 units? Yeah. Then you'll have met and exceeded your 10% requirement under 40B. And the question is, that could happen sooner than 5 years? This plan, depending on what happens in the community, or it could happen after the plan. But whenever it happens, the trust will want to take a step back and say, okay, now that we've achieved our goal number 2, what do we do now? And do we continue to do the same thing? Or do we look at, are there other local needs that we can use our funds for to help within the purposes of the trust, creating and preserving housing? And the idea is really just to be aware that when that happens, the trust doesn't need to fold up its books and go home. The trust can still have an active role in the community in helping to meet your local housing needs. But the idea is that they want to take a step back and figure out, at that point, what do they need to do next? Okay, so I know that this is very small, but if you have a copy of the plan, it's on page 16. So what I like to do to try to make things real is to create a 5-year budget. Now, just know that the trust cannot forward commit the revenue that it's hoping to receive. And it also can't forward commit what opportunities are going to come up and how they're going to really end up recommending to the selectmen to spend the money. But this is just an idea. It provides a framework. And so you say, well, Jen, you just laid out 9 initiatives. How are we going to afford those? And that's what this is trying to answer. If you were really to try to create 26 units, how many units would you try to create for each of those initiatives? And so you can see in the second column from the right that we've included target affordable housing units for each of the initiatives. We've also tried to budget out how much we think each of those will cost. And so if you look in the column that says 5-year total, which is the third from the right, you'll see that we've taken a crack at an estimate of how much we think each one would cost. And then we backed out, all right, well, how much money is there in the trust now? How much would we need to fill that gap? And each year, where do we think we're going to get that revenue from? And so this is all an idea. I just want to stress that. And this could change over time. And in fact, I would be surprised if it didn't change. It will, like 99.9%, I'm sure, these numbers will look different next year and the year after as they continue to update. Well, this is what we actually did. And now we want to adjust these numbers. Does that make sense just in terms of the purpose of doing this? Yes?
And I don't want really to talk about anything specific other than the Board of Zoning Appeals has approved the 4B project, which is on the field.
Right.
And, I mean, it could use all or substantially all of this budget in 1 year, theoretically at least. And I just wanted, I understand that this is for planning purposes, but I'm curious about whether it expresses any sort of a view about whether to support a large project or not to.
Yeah. So it does look at under number 3, construction on privately owned property, and they're budgeting over the 5 years $600,000. I know that that is probably a different amount than was requested early on for, I think you're talking about the Maple Woods project, which I understand is under litigation, and trust me, I don't have any details to share, so I'm not going to spoil anybody's confidentiality. But the idea would be, it's not known what will happen with that particular project. But the trust does want, whether they end up funding something like that or not, they realize that that type of project could get the town well beyond the 10% requirement. And that's when the last strategy would be triggered. It would be triggered earlier than this 5-year plan. And they would need to take a step back and say, well, now that we've either A, spent this money on this project, or B, now that we're over the 10%, now what do? We still probably, and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but my guess is they'll still think that some of these other things are important to do anyway. but they might not need to all count on the subsidized housing inventory. You can look at doing higher income for some of these ideas rather than things that would be 80% or less. Or you could, look at refocusing on other things. For example, the public awareness campaign, looking at your zoning bylaw. You still have housing, local housing needs in the community that one development wouldn't fully address. And so the idea is that that would trigger that last long-term strategy. Okay, now that this is done, whether or not they choose to spend money on it or recommend to the Board of Selectmen that money spent, they would need to refocus on their priorities. Does that answer your question? I know I can't tell you a definitive one way or another, but that's as much as really I think anybody knows at this point. But we did talk quite a bit about that. Okay, so without going into all these numbers and all the details, I think you can take your time and look at that. You have a copy of it. But generally what you'll see is up on top are the sources, or hoped for sources, I should say. The funds carry over from prior year in the first column, the FY19, is actually what they do have now, and that includes funds carry over from the prior year, plus what they anticipate in there. They do have a rental property that they own. I mentioned the trust created one rental unit. Well, they do get rental income from that unit, and so that's what that is. And then they do make some interest on their funds too, so there's a line for that. And really that's the only funding we're talking about for the upcoming fiscal year 19. And they have a number of uses for that, and you'll see how the numbers break down, and there's still leftover money at the bottom. And that money then carries forward into FY20. So I'm not an accountant. If anybody here is an accountant, this is not how a normal budget would be done by an accountant, but this is what makes sense to me. But if anybody has questions about how do you put this together, it's kind of like balancing a checkbook in my mind. And so you'll also see that they don't spend all their funds in any given year. Although at the end of the 5 years, they're down to about $40,000. But that's assuming that they're going to be asking for additional funds from the Community Preservation Act starting for FY20. And that would require an application submitted to the Community Preservation Committee. The committee would need to then consider what the application is for, recommend or not recommend to town meeting. If it was recommended to town meeting, then town meeting would need to vote in a simple majority whether or not to allocate those funds to the trust. So I want you to, be very crystal clear that none of this is assuming that those funds will at the end of the day be allocated. This is a bit of a wish list, but it's also showing if we really want to create those 26 units and do these different things, this is the money that we think we're going to need, and the places we're going to try to get that from are CPA funds, continue the rental income that we're gaining from the rental property, and the interest. And then further down in the timeline, starting in FY22, you'll see that they're also hoping that they'll be able to receive some private donations from citizens in Wenham, possibly. So they would need to think about how they're going to go about asking for those donations. But as far as I know, they are tax deductible, so just a little plug. Anybody can write a check to a trust like this at any time, even if the trust doesn't put out a call for private donations. Some trusts do that, and they do get money or land donated to them. Yes?
You could donate a piece of property.
You could donate a piece of property, and it could either be used for housing or it could be sold and monetized. So that would be a source of revenue for the trust. So that is pretty much the whole presentation, and I know that I've glossed over some of the real details in the plan, but I didn't want to spend too much of your time here. It's almost 8 o'clock. I'm happy to take more questions if there are any.
Town of Wenham, right?
Fort Blossom Trust.
Yes.
I do have a question.
Fort Blossom Trust, they're a separate entity.
They're a legal entity? They're a 501c3 entity?
And so UMass Gerontology Institute.
Oh, good. Yes. I'm working in Dedham, livable Dedham right now, and also in Bedford, and they're both working with UMass.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
So they just did a needs assessment through focus groups, and
We'll check that.
affordable housing was a premier topic, apparently, was the initial
Mhm.
feedback I got from them, but we're waiting for a report from them. So I think we could synchronize some of this effort, really.
Yes.
The public, the education, the awareness, the that, but is there anything that would help provide funding for structural changes to, to someone's home reasonable specifications? Is there any investigation of what sort of exists at the state level? Or would the trust ever be a resource for that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so the short answer is there are programs, and I think the Home Consortium could potentially be a funding source for a type of a rehab program to help with accessibility and other building code improvements. The trust cannot get involved in that type of program unless it is actually creating or preserving affordable housing. And those types of programs don't create or preserve affordable housing. Right, to help with ADA accessibility modifications, and unfortunately the CPA funds can't be used for that either. A lot of communities have tried, but the way the laws were written, it's not part of their purposes. Yeah.
Can I just add that a little? One of the things I think we talked about on the trust speaks to something that you said, and that is that a lot of us are doing planning in different groups. And at some point in time, we all, I think, talked about the need and the efficiency to get together and talk to each other about, how our plans may be integrated, how our communication may be integrated. There's the Asian plan, open space and recreation plan is being developed. I have a feeling there could be something about affordable housing in there as well. So we did, is that fair? We did on the trust talk about as a sort of side action item to just try to integrate all of them.
I went to your roundtable. I was part of your roundtable.
Great.
Yeah.
It wasn't really mine, but.
No, but the roundtable.
So we're just all
Yeah.
vertically
I know,
looking
glad
at
you
our
went.
own specific issues, but talking to each other. So
We're trying to be a farm and not a silo.
there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that gets at a lot of those communication goals that you were asking about, goals and strategies, is making sure you're not just being a silo, like Michelle said. Yeah.
Which is, a pattern that often exists in many communities.
Yes.
So we change it. So we'll change it.
Good. Any other questions or need for clarification? All right, well, that's all I have then. I don't know if the selectmen or select board, want to adjourn or have any questions for me
Do we have
or any deliberation. I don't know if you're deliberating or.
Excellent
Yeah.
presentation. It was very informative, and thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
don't think our intention here tonight was to deliberate
Okay.
on this. I think if we need to have a deliberation, we'll put that in a separate meeting. We really wanted to get this out to the public, and also if there's anyone who has input that they think about tomorrow, or the next day, please get back to Josh or to me, because the trust is very interested in thinking about input. I don't think there's anything specific.
I'll just make one little plug, which is, we meet on the third Wednesday here at 7 o'clock. You're all welcome.
All right.
Very
Is there
good.
Anything else
Thank
you
you.
wanted to talk about in the preview?
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent presentation.
Motion to adjourn.
I'll move that.
Second.
Aye.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks, Gal.
Tough subject.
I think they have a
Things like this
realistic,
and nobody
thoughtful approach.
Depends on the community. Yeah. I think the trust did a good job getting the word out too, which was. Yeah.
The waterfront in terms of